In 2 Samuel 6 verses 12 to 19, we read this morning together of the return of the Ark of the Covenant to the city of Jerusalem. The Ark was kept in the house of Abinadab in a small town outside Jerusalem called Kiryat Yearim. Now, Kiryat Yearim was about 13 kilometers outside Jerusalem, and David gathered all the men of importance, and they set out and they fetched the Ark of the Covenant from Abinadab's house, and they brought it back to the city of Jerusalem. And 2 Samuel describes to us the festivities that took place. It was quite a joyous occasion, so joyous that even David himself, as the king of the nation, leaped and danced in front of the ark as they returned these 13 kilometers to the city center of Jerusalem. Michal, the daughter of Saul, who was given to David as his first wife, saw this spectacle, and she despised her husband for humiliating himself probably as the king of the nation, and here he is dancing and leaping in front of the Ark of the Covenant. But there's something else peculiar happening in this scene. 13 kilometers. Every 6 steps, that is more or less every 5 meters, they stopped, they slaughtered an ox and a fattened calf, and then they moved on again. 5 steps, 6 steps, 5 meters, and they stopped, and they slaughtered an ox and a fattened calf, and they moved on again. In 13 kilometers, if you do this, 2,167 oxes would have been slaughtered, and 2,167 fattened calves would have been killed. Just imagine if every one of those oxes and calves had 30 liters of blood inside their bodies. 130,000 liters of blood would have been spilled over a distance of 13 kilometers. That gives you, if my calculations is correct, around 1,000 liters of blood every 10 meters. What would Canada Health said about that? It would have been quite the show. And that is what the Bible describes to us. It is a show of blood, a blood trail for 13 kilometers. And David, in front of this spectacle, dancing and leaping, no wonder Michal was filled with disgust when she saw this festival. No wonder we talk about Yahweh and his bloodlust when we speak of this God of the Old Testament. Yet they brought the ark ready for the temple in Jerusalem, because David had it in his mind that he wants to build the temple for God. He was a person of humble roots. You know, when Samuel was sent to bring the ointment and to choose the next king who will follow up Saul, he went to the house of Jesse, and there Jesse gathered all his sons around the table, and they sat down ready to hear the verdict of Samuel, who would be the next king. And then Samuel stopped and said, "Wait a minute, are these all the sons you have?" And Jesse said, "Oh no, we have one not important one, the youngest." You know, the youngest is always not important. I am the youngest. And he said, and he's somewhere out there in the fields tending to the flock. But we don't really need him. And Samuel said, no, we can't go on. We have to have all your sons here. And they called David in as this young boy tending to the flock. And to his brothers, that would have probably been humiliating. You know, the important ones was around the table, and now everything stopped just to brought in this young guy. And then Samuel said, "It's him. He's the next king." Growing up in those circumstances, in David must have been some sense of, I'm not important enough. You know, I was left out in the fields when the family gathered. And then they stopped and brought me in just because Samuel asked for it. But everything changed the day this happened. Goliath stood against the Israelites and said, and he was a giant, and he said, if there's anybody that wants to fight me, come. And here comes this youngest son of Jesse, and he overcame Goliath, and all of his fortune changed. I bet you every young woman in that city of Jerusalem will fall over their feet to meet this young boy from Jesse. They would have thrown themselves to him because he's the giant slayer. He's the man that stood up against this giant, a small boy, and he overcame this giant. And his whole fortune changed when Saul took him in as one of his own sons in the palace, preparing him for the coming of the new kingship. But Saul didn't really like him. Because Saul knew my days are counted, because this guy is going to replace me. But David, he had another side of him. He wasn't just the small boy from Jesse. He wasn't just the guy that slayed a giant. He always had a soft spot. He could play beautiful harp music. And he composed beautiful psalms, which we still read in our Bibles these days. So there was this person with these two sides. On the one side, he was this person being prepared to become king, and on the other side, he was this soft person with a soft side with music and art that meant a lot to him. And he wanted to rebuild or build the first temple in Jerusalem. And after he conquered most of the nations around Israel and collected their territories and their lands into the kingdom of Israel, he probably sat back in his palace being the king of this new big kingdom, thinking, now the next thing I need to do is to build a house for God, a house for Yahweh. And then he went out and he got the Ark of the Covenant, because that's a very important part when he wanted to build the first temple or the first house of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And then God said, not so fast. You're not the one that's going to build this temple. Your son will maybe, but definitely not you. The moment state and religion marry each other, there's problems. King Henry VIII of England wrestled the Roman Catholic Church for power, and he won. And he pushed the Catholics out, and he centered the Church of England's seat of the high priest, you can say, within the palace in England. And that's the way it is till this day. And you would think after Henry VIII conquered the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, that peace and calmness and prosperity will return to England. Yet, he set out and created a war against the Catholics and killed them, pushed them out of England, and conquered their buildings and take their riches for the Church of England. State and religion together is dangerous. The Catholic Church from Spain set out to South and Central America, and they destroyed civilizations and peoples in the name of God. The same happened when the English and French came to North America. They did the same thing here. The same thing happened in Africa when the state and the church went into colonizing the dark continent. And the same thing happened in Australia and New Zealand when the indigenous people paid with their lives because the state and the religion wanted to conquer them and made them Christians. But their sort of Christian, not just any Christian. And if you didn't abide, you paid with your life. And it's kind of the same thing that King David did. Because on the one side, he was this warlord that fought the wars in the name of Yahweh and killed, and he did ethnic cleansing. He wiped some nations off the map of the earth, and he combined that riches into the kingdom of Israel. And he did other stuff. We don't read much about this prophet. just short verses in the Bible. But he must have been an extraordinary man, the prophet Nathan. He was the royal prophet of the palace in the time of King David. So he had the task to bring the word of God to the king of Israel. And he must be true to this kingdom, to the king, and to God. But Nathan stood up, and he stands out as one of the big prophets because he had a conscience. He could not go along with this. And when David had it in his mind, I'm this big statesman, now I also want to be this big religious man by building the temple in Jerusalem that will not only be the house of Yahweh, but that will also be a monument celebrating my victories in this world. And then Nathan knocked on the door, and he walked in. And he brought a message, basically 3 basic points. First of all, he said to David, you will not build this temple, because you've put the Ark of the Covenant in a tent, and I think God is satisfied with that. You brought the Ark back. You will not build this temple, secondly, because what God asked of you was to keep these commandments, and you couldn't even do that. And thirdly, you will not build this temple for God, because what God expected of you is to show the love that He showed you to your family and people. So what did David do to deserve this? He was a complex person, maybe due to his background. He raped, womanized. He committed or tried to commit murder. He organized murder. He killed many. He took what was not his and gathered it in the name of Yahweh. And then on the other side, he had such a deep friendship with Jonathan, the son of Saul, that he wrote and said, the love that we have is even better than the love that I have for a woman. He had this other side to him, making him this complex person, the king, the warrior, the warlord, and yet the soft poet, the musician, the guy that can have beautiful relationships. We find ourselves in this picture of the king and the building of the temple. As Christians, we go out and we want to create this mega churches. And we feel very accomplished when we do that. And the next thing when you have a mega church is you create a TV channel. And then you show what you do in that big arena to the world, kind of bragging and say, look at us. Where are you, little churches in Hamilton? You can't accomplish this. And this goes on across the world. And studies show that these mega churches has a life cycle. They flourish and they reach their peak, and then the chief pastor does something stupid normally, and then they start to go down. And they end up huge arenas empty on a Sunday. We saw this in Pretoria in South Africa with one of the local churches that built an arena that seated 7,000 people. And they did that in the early 2000s, and about 10 years later, they had like 200 to 300 people sitting in a small circle down in the arena. Same thing happened there. We read from the Gospel of Mark, and Jesus had a specific message in that, in Mark 6, verse 30 to 34. Jesus came to his disciples and he said, whoa, you've been so busy, you didn't even have time to eat and to look after yourself. Stop this. Go to a secluded, quiet place, relax and rest, and replenish yourselves. Look after yourself. I get a regular email from a person in this church saying, watch out, don't burn out. Luckily, we don't have a mega church, so I won't burn out. But that's kind of Jesus' message. Watch out, don't burn out. Look after yourself. Take care of yourself. Because Jesus, if I understand him correctly, was not the person that went out, and he is the founder of Christianity, but he was not the person that went out and showed us the example of creating a mega church. He was this guy. He kneeled down when they brought a prostitute to him, and they asked him to throw the first stone so that she can be killed because she was caught red-handed, overstepping the law of Yahweh. And then Jesus, you know the words that he said, the one without sin, the one that is not missing the point, because that is what sin means, the one that is not missing the point, cast you the first stone. So all of them ready with stones in their hands, you would go like putting it behind your back and just let it fall down and softly turn around and walked away. And suddenly he was alone with her. And he said to her, I don't judge you. Your faith saves you. A woman reached out and she just touched the seam of his garment. And he felt the light flowing from him to her because she believed he can heal her, and it happened. And he stopped and he said to the crowd, make space. Who touched me? I mean, there was a crowd around him. He would have been touched all the time, but he pushed them away and said, wait, there's one that touched me in faith. And I want to know who it is. And this woman stepped forward, probably very scared. And he said to her, don't worry, your faith will save you. I am not here to judge you. Jesus reached out, and when he did these beautiful miracles, it was normally 90% of the time towards the individual. He created an individual relationship with individual persons. And when there was a crowd, he was kind of sometimes really uneasy with that, climbing in a boat, going a little bit into the sea so that they don't gather too close to him, and then he taught them, spoke to them. His point of view was definitely not going out to create the biggest church that you can and focus all your projects on only those that will drag in or bring in the people into your pews. No, his focus was get onto your knees. The same message that Nathan had for David. Show the love that God shows you to those around you. Get onto your knees like he did. They brought a prostitute. Why would they bring a prostitute while there were prostitutes in the temple, sitting on the steps of the temple waiting for their clientele who was on their way to pray to Yahweh in the temple, the house of the Lord in Jerusalem? But they singled out this one woman, caught her red-handed, and bring her to Jesus. I think it's because they didn't share in her profits because she wasn't a prostitute at the temple. So they didn't like her. When you're a prostitute in the temple, surely you have to give to the temple some of your profits that you make from the temple. This lady was working behind the scenes in the back alleys of Jerusalem, and they didn't see the money she was making, so they didn't like her. Maybe that's also a picture we could keep in our heads about churches today. Instead of getting on their knees and helping her to find the way, they brought her to Jesus and said, let's stone her. So Solomon did build the temple. The temple was not that very successful. In 586, the Babylonians destroyed it. They went in exile, came back in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, rebuilt it. In 70 after Christ, it was destroyed again by the Romans. And it is destroyed till this day. That's why they fight a war in Palestine and Israel. Because the Muslims want to build their mosque, and the Jews want to build their temple. They pray to the same God because they are both Abrahamic religions, of which we are also part. We are also an Abrahamic religion. And we all are fighting each other because we do not understand God and we do not know how to go on our knees and serve. We have it in our minds to be like David. I have the political power, now I want the religious power. And the temple, which is the house of God, showed us what happened to people that wants to do that. It's destroyed. Surely the Almighty God of heaven and earth can look after his own house. Why would he let it be destroyed twice and burned to the ground? Why wouldn't he give the land to them to rebuild the temple? It's because we do not understand the true God. We do not understand light, and we do not understand love, and we do not understand what it means to go on our knees serving. So what do we have? Do we have a house of the Lord where we have worship services and projects to impress the world and to bring in the masses and the crowds? Or do we have a home of God? Because a house you build out of mortar and stone. Every stone they bought to build the Sixtine Chapel in Rome was bought with money that people paid to pay for their sins. How do we handle this building? Is it a place where we impress, or is it a place where we serve? Because Jesus showed where the true home of God is. It's not in the tabernacle. It's not in the temple. It's in your heart. That's where the true home of God is. And that true home becomes visible the moment we go on our knees and we serve. Amen.